The hidden story behind the Nazi project that vanished overnight. The Third Reich, spring 1944. The last gasp of ambition. It began as one of Nazi Germany's most ambitious secret programs, a desperate, high-stakes gamble against the creeping inevitability of defeat. By 1944, the Thousand-Year Reich was contracting. The vast, mechanized armies of the Soviet Union were grinding westward. The skies over the fatherland were choked with the contrails of 10,000 American and British bombers. Germany was running out of fuel, out of steel, and critically, out of time. Yet, in the shadow of this collapse, Hitler's obsession with the Wunderwaffe, the wonder weapon, became more fervent. His belief was absolute. Salvation lay not in conventional warfare, but in a single, decisive technological leap that would neutralize the Allies' numerical superiority and force a negotiated peace. This belief poured vast, finite resources into projects that defied physics and sanity. This particular project was different. It wasn't a V-1 cruise missile, a V-2 rocket, or even the familiar Me-262 jet fighter. Those projects, while secret, were logged, organized, and tracked by various ministries. This one was decoupled entirely. It existed in a vacuum of absolute security, deliberate construct of compartmentalization designed to ensure that if the entire regime fell, the true nature of this final weapon would be lost forever. The facility itself was buried deep within the mountainous terrain of southern Germany, carved out of granite beneath a dense pine forest. Its official designation was meaningless. Forschungszentrum X7, Research Center X7. To the skeletal SS Guard detail, it was simply the labyrinth, the anatomy of secrecy, a project so sensitive that even high-ranking officers were kept out of the loop. This was the guiding principle of General Der Flieger Kammhuber, the man tasked with overseeing its security. He applied the concept of Schattenbauweise bulkhead construction to intelligence itself. No single person saw the full blueprint. The men who designed the revolutionary high-output turbine engine were housed in a different bunker from those who designed the radical, swept-forward wing geometry. The chemists who formulated the volatile, hypergolic rocket fuel, a necessary component to provide the initial boost to extreme speeds, were isolated entirely, working under the constant presence of armed SS security who spoke a dialect they couldn't understand. Blueprints were never stored in paper form for long. They were locked in steel vaults, accessible only by two senior engineers simultaneously, and required a third party to verify the two-key system. They were viewed, committed to memory, and then returned to the vault. Any transcription was done by hand, in code, and immediately destroyed after use. Test flights were conducted only at night, in the moonless gloom. The complex had its own isolated runway, barely more than a reinforced concrete strip blasted out of the mountainside. The plane, or the prototype, or whatever name the engineers dared whisper, was towed out under heavy canvas shrouds. The sound of its engine, a terrifying hybrid shriek of turbojet and liquid fuel rocket booster, was muffled by the mountain walls. Only a handful of technical personnel ever witnessed the actual flight, and even they were forced to wear specialized, tinted goggles to obscure the shape and scale of the machine as it climbed. The most extraordinary measure of all was the personnel rotation. Staff was shifted every 48 hours so no one saw the full picture. The scientists were constantly shuttled between isolated bunkers, often under sedation during transport to prevent accidental disclosure of the location. This rotation created a dizzying, disorienting environment where trust was non-existent, and collaboration was reduced to the bare minimum of technical necessity. The result was brilliant, but paranoid. The facility was a well-oiled machine of creation and fear. The noise that stopped. For 6 grueling months, the labyrinth was a hive of frantic, desperate activity. The rhythmic cycle of engine runs, the screech of metal being milled, the constant, background thrum of the ventilation systems fighting the deep mountain heat. This was the sound of the Reich's last hope. And then, in one single night, in the deep twilight hours of a cold Bavarian spring, it vanished. The signal went out at 2 o'clock hours. Not a radio message, which could be intercepted. It was a coded light signal flashed from the main command bunker to the surrounding guard towers. Action nichts. Operation nothing. What followed was not a chaotic evacuation, but a terrifyingly efficient erasure. Buildings emptied. The scientists were loaded into armored transports, not for safety, but for immediate and permanent removal from the continent, their knowledge too precious to lose, yet too dangerous to leave behind. Tools were left on tables. In the main assembly bay, a half-finished welding job lay abandoned on a workbench. The oxygen tank was still open, hissing a gentle, quiet farewell to the empty cavern. This was intentional. The goal wasn't to evacuate everything, but to create the illusion of a facility suddenly and completely abandoned, without time for cleaning. A phantom base. Test stands were still warm from recent engine runs. The scent of burnt hydrazine, the acrid, metallic tang of rocket propellant, lingered in the air vents. The engine logging equipment was wiped clean, its vacuum tubes still glowing faintly from the heat of recent use. It was as if thousands of hours and millions of Reichsmarks simply evaporated. Project's essence was gone. Only the physical shell remained, a huge, silent testament to a memory that the Nazi regime desperately wanted to delete. But why? If the project was a success, they would have rushed it to production. If it was a failure, they would have salvaged the components and moved on to the next Wunderwaffe. The completeness of the erasure suggested a different, more chilling scenario. What happened inside that facility in the final hours? Did they achieve success, and realize the machine was so uncontrollable, so fundamentally unstable, that they couldn't risk the Allies reverse engineering it? Did they achieve catastrophic failure, a disaster so profound that it necessitated the immediate annihilation of all evidence? And what was the project that the Nazis tried to erase so completely that not even the Allied technical intelligence units could find evidence the next morning? The world outside noticed only the silence. The Allied bombing runs over the area ceased to find anti-aircraft resistance. The faint, high-frequency radio chatter they had been monitoring disappeared entirely. The labyrinth was gone, replaced by a ghost. Southern Bavaria, May 1945. The Technical Intelligence T-Force. The war in Europe was over, but the intelligence war was just beginning. While the public celebrated, Allied T-Force, technical intelligence teams composed of engineers, linguists, and combat-ready specialists were racing across the occupied zones like ferrets, digging up every last piece of German technological genius before the Soviets or rival Allied factions could claim it. Dr. Julian Vance, an American aeronautical engineer turned intelligence major, was the man tasked with the labyrinth. He had intercepted the initial reports of the sudden radio silence and understood its implication. Target was not destroyed, it was hidden. Vance's team found the site based on seismic data and the unusual pattern of roads leading into the forest, roads that appeared on no civilian map. When they finally breached the facility's huge, camouflage-painted steel doors, they were met not with resistance, but with a profound, unnerving emptiness. "It's like they were raptured," muttered Sergeant O'Malley, holding his Sten gun loosely. Like the entire crew just evaporated at the dinner bell. All investigators found were fragments. The Germans had been masters of the scorched earth policy, but this wasn't scorched earth. This was surgical sterilization. Every piece of paper, every film reel, every logbook that wasn't immediately necessary for an operation was gone. Vance and his team began the painstaking process of forensic reverse engineering, reading the story in the dust and the shadows. The scorched concrete bay. The first clue was the main test hangar. It was a cathedral of reinforced concrete, designed to house the aircraft. In the center of the floor was a massive scorch mark, a huge, black, vitrified patch of concrete the size of a small house. This wasn't a fire soot. This mark was caused by intense, localized heat over a very short period. The concrete hadn't just burned, it had melted and reformed into a glass-like shell. Vance ran his gloved hand over the surface. Rocket fuel, he concluded. Hypergolic. Like the V2, but much more powerful. Look at the edges. The burn radius is contained. Whatever was here, they didn't have time to move it before they ignited the engines for a final test, or perhaps, a final disposal burn. This evidence suggested catastrophic failure. The extreme, volatile fuel had likely ignited prematurely, or the engine had exploded on its stand. The crew had run, but they hadn't run far. The forklift frozen mid-load. In an adjacent loading bay, a heavy-duty electric forklift was frozen mid-load. The machine was tilted forward, its tines raised just a few feet off the ground, as if the driver had slammed on the brakes and abandoned his post instantly. It was carrying nothing but a large, specially constructed wooden cradle. Inside the cradle, there were scorch marks identical to those on the hangar floor, only fainter. This implied the object had been moved from the hangar floor and placed on the forklift. Then the work was abruptly halted. They were moving the engine, Vance realized, pointing to the load distribution on the cradle. Or maybe the entire prototype, and they were interrupted. If they were trying to move it out to dispose of it, the emergency disposal protocol must have been triggered right here. The disposal was clearly sudden and interrupted. Half-melted aluminum. The most crucial piece of physical evidence was found in the complex's industrial furnace, the smelter used for recycling waste metal. The furnace was designed for efficient, clean disposal. But jammed in the chute, half-melted and deformed by the heat, was a large, crescent-shaped chunk of high-grade aluminum alloy. This wasn't structural support, it resembled a prototype fuselage. The shape, even in its melted state, was unlike any known Allied or German aircraft. It wasn't the rectangular cross-section of a bomber or the bulbous shape of a conventional jet. It was impossibly sleek. The metal was light, durable, and shaped with compound curves that screamed high-speed aerodynamics. Vance spent hours sketching the possible original form. The profile suggested a lifting body, an aircraft where the entire fuselage generated lift, designed for speeds that only rocketry could achieve. It was a shape for a machine that was intended to fly not just fast, but near the very edge of the Earth's atmosphere. A machine that was half jet, half rocket, intended for stratospheric interception or bombing. The cryptic notation, the final piece of the puzzle lay, ironically, in the one place the Germans failed to sanitize completely, the personal effects locker of Oberingenieur Klaus Fischer, the chief of aerodynamics. Fischer had been too meticulous, or too panicked, to erase his last action. Inside his desk, tucked behind a photograph of his family, was a small, leather-bound logbook, the kind an engineer carries for quick notes and calculations. The last page was not filled with equations, but with a series of quick, tense directives scribbled in pencil, their indentation deep into the paper. The handwriting was jerky, rushed, almost desperate. 1:15 a.m. T exceeded limit. Violent oscillations. Loss of control surfaces. 1:25 a.m. Failure containment breach. Total loss of pilot. No attempt at recovery. 1:30 a.m. Do not record final tests. The numbers are impossible. They cannot be known. 1:32 a.m. Prepare emergency disposal protocol. Action NICTS initiated. Begin personnel removal. Vance read the final lines repeatedly. Total loss of pilot. No attempt at recovery. And the numbers are impossible. They cannot be known. Whatever they were building, it was dangerous. It had killed its pilot, and its performance was so revolutionary, so far outside the known parameters of flight, that the engineers realized the data itself was a weapon. They didn't want the Allies to know what was possible. So dangerous that the moment something went wrong, the order wasn't to fix it, or save the data, but to destroy everything. The conclusion was chilling. The project had achieved a momentary, terrifying breakthrough, a peak speed or altitude that shattered the limits of the airframe. The pilot was killed by the performance, not by the enemy. The engineers, standing over the wreckage of their success, understood the gravity. To leave the physical evidence and the technical records would give the Allies a decade's head start. In their last act of loyalty to the Reich's technological superiority, they chose a self-inflicted oblivion. They preferred a terrifying mystery to a clear, usable blueprint for the enemy. The labyrinth had not been evacuated. It had been intentionally deleted. And what remained? The melted metal, the scorched rock, and the scribbled confession of a dead pilot, was the only evidence that the world was about to enter a completely new, and far more terrifying, era of flight. For nearly 4 decades, the silence surrounding the labyrinth was total. The Allied T forces, having failed to recover any substantial evidence, filed their reports, marked the area as cleared, minimal data, and moved on to the more tangible secrets of the V-2 and the Me-262. The story of Forschungszentrum X-7 faded into the realm of conspiracy theories and campfire tales told by former SS guards. But time, the most unforgiving historian, eventually broke the oath of secrecy. The technicians who had been forcibly relocated after Action NICTS were now old men, their wartime terror replaced by the dull ache of guilt and mortality. The Cold War had softened the borders of their memory. The threat of Soviet reprisal was less potent than the fear of carrying a deadly secret to the grave. Decades later, 3 elderly former technicians, a hydraulics specialist, an engine calibration expert, and a telemetry analyst, finally told their stories to various German and American historians. Their accounts, fragmented and often contradictory in the minor details, converged on one central, terrifying truth. According to them, the project wasn't a weapon, not exactly. It was an experimental aircraft that pushed every boundary of 1940s engineering. It was not designed to carry a bomb, it was designed to break physics. Its code name among the engineers, whispered in the darkness, was Flugkörper Null, Flight Body Zero. It was the testbed for the post-war future, a pure research vessel intended to gather data on the unknown forces that tore aircraft apart near the speed of sound. The airframe, they recalled, was unlike anything built before. The designer, a brilliant and tormented man named Dr. Volker, had discarded conventional fuselages. He designed the craft as a true lifting body, a machine where the entire hull was shaped like a massive wing, reducing drag to an absolute minimum. It was tiny, brutally sleek, and terrifyingly fragile. The wings were razor thin, recalled Hans, the hydraulics expert, during a confidential interview. Like a knife edge, we had to use magnesium and a very expensive alloy of steel mixed with something brittle. Something from Sweden. It was strong enough to resist the bending forces, but not the heat. Dr. Volker knew it would fail. He just wanted it to hold together long enough to get the readings. The engineering was a catalog of desperate, boundary-pushing solutions. Extreme speed airframe. The plane was designed to handle speeds that would cause conventional aluminum to melt or deform due to aerodynamic heating. Its structure was semi-monocoque, relying on tension rather than mass, making it incredibly light, but prone to catastrophic structural failure if stressed unevenly. Volatile fuels. The power plant required more than just standard kerosene-based jet fuel. The main propulsion was a hybrid system. The technician Joseph detailed the fuel mixing process with trembling recollection. The main turbojet was for taxi and subsonic climb. But for the run, the thrust needed to punch through the wall, we used a supplemental engine. It was an adaptation of the ME-163 rocket motor, running on T-Stoff and C-Stoff. He shuddered. T-Stoff was concentrated hydrogen peroxide, C-Stoff was hydrazine hydrate. These hypergolic propellants were instantly reactive upon contact, generating immense, terrifying thrust, but they were monstrously unstable. A leak, a drop, or an incorrect mix meant immediate, lethal explosion. Untested control surfaces. As the Americans were soon to discover with their own sonic research, conventional ailerons and rudders lose effectiveness at high Mach numbers. The Germans had attempted to solve the Mach tuck, the nose-diving tendency, by engineering the entire horizontal tail assembly to pivot. This all-moving tail, or stabilator, was a revolutionary concept, but in the prototype, it was linked to a sensitive, over-engineered hydraulic system that was prone to violent feedback loops. The pilot wasn't just flying the plane, he was wrestling a ghost. A power plant no one fully trusted. The machine used two distinct engines. The jet provided high efficiency, the rocket provided the necessary violence. The transitional moment, when the pilot ignited the rocket while the jet was already at full power, was called the moment of unity. Every engineer who witnessed it knew that unity was a poetic name for a controlled explosion. The collective understanding among the men was chillingly clear. They weren't fighting the Americans with this machine. They were fighting the atmosphere, fighting heat, fighting G-forces, and fighting the very laws of physics. One technician, the calibration expert named Willie, summed up the dark ambition perfectly. We were building something the sky wasn't ready for. Every calculation we made about drag and lift was a guess, because we had no data. The American machines, the P-80, they flew. Our machine screamed. It was not meant for combat. It was meant to give us the paper that proved we were smarter. It was a single-use scientific probe. The danger wasn't the Allies. The danger was the machine itself. They were standing next to a pressurized tube of explosives and revolutionary metal, praying it would survive long enough to transmit 10 seconds of data before it either dissolved from heat or tore itself apart from turbulence. The decision to erase the project, in this context, was not just political, it was a desperate, panicked act of damage control by men who had realized they had crossed a line they couldn't uncross. Part 4. The test that triggered the overnight evacuation. The Labyrinth runway. The final night, April 1945. The end of the war was audible even in the deep, underground bunkers. Artillery rumbled distantly, a constant, low-frequency reminder that the world above was collapsing. The atmosphere in the labyrinth was frantic. Dr. Volker and General Kamhuber knew they had one chance left. The Americans were days, perhaps hours, away from breaching the outer perimeter. On the final night, the prototype, designated officially in the logs as the X-7 Sturmvogel, Storm Bird, was rolled out for its final ground test. It wasn't a flight test. It was a maximum duration thrust validation, the final, all-or-nothing moment before the ultimate launch. The test was simple. Ignite the primary jet, accelerate to maximum, then fire the rocket booster for a full 10-second burn, gathering data on the transition phase and the internal pressures of the combined system. The crew was minimal. Dr. Volker, General Kamhuber, the pilot the poor soul mentioned in the logbook, whose name was lost to history, and a skeleton crew of engineers including Hans, Joseph, and Willie, sealed inside a thick, reinforced concrete observation bunker 50 yards from the runway. The tension was suffocating. Every man knew the Sturmvogel was fueled with enough hypergolic propellant to vaporize the entire runway. The test begins. The pilot sealed the cockpit. The hatch was a complex piece of engineering, designed to withstand immense pressure but offering no escape if the rocket motor ignited incorrectly. The signal was given. The primary turbojet whined, then surged, pushing the experimental machine along the runway track used for static testing. The first sound was a familiar, if deafening, jet roar. It was loud, heavy, and resonant against the mountain walls. Then, the pilot hit the booster ignition switch. What followed was not an engine ignition. It was a geological event. Witnesses described a scream of acceleration. The low jet roar was instantly eclipsed by a terrifying, high-pitched shriek of the rocket booster. It was not the controlled, steady burn they had seen in previous tests. This was an unconstrained, exponential surge. Instruments spiking into the red. Inside the observation bunker, the telemetry analyst, Willie, watched his needles violently smash against the glass of their housings. The thrust readout was instantly off the chart. The fuel flow was impossible. The engine was consuming its lethal propellant at a rate nobody had predicted, an engine surge caused by an unstable, perhaps contaminated, mix of the T-Stoff and C-Stoff. The light was blinding, a blinding white, almost blue flare of exhaust that seemed to consume the entire eastern end of the runway. The heat was immense, even through the observation slit, and the sound was so profound that several technicians were instantly deafened in one ear. And then came the blast that shook nearby towns. It wasn't a conventional explosion, which would be a sharp, singular kaboom. This was a terrifying, prolonged wave of compressed air, the acoustic shockwave of an engine running at utterly impossible, uncontainable power, followed by a thunderous tremor as the prototype's thrust violently destabilized the entire test stand. When the sound died, a high-pitched ringing left in its wake. A thick cloud of propellant smoke, acrid and corrosive, drifted over the facility. Dr. Vance and his men later found the scorched runway. They found the melted concrete. But the strangest part, there was no wreckage, no prototype, no engine remains. The test stand, a massive steel framework anchored deep into the granite, was ripped clean out of the ground. The only thing left was the metallic residue of the high-speed burn, fused into the runway asphalt. The consensus among the terrified, shell-shocked engineers was that the engine surge had been so violent, so utterly overpowering, that it had torn the prototype free from its restraints and launched it. But not simply down the runway. Given the angle and the immense force, it had vanished vertically, or simply disintegrated into fine, high-altitude fragments that would scatter across the continent. General Kamhuber, standing in the middle of the smoking crater, looked at the shattered instruments. He didn't need a report. The numbers were not just in the red, they were erased. The Sturmvogel had succeeded. It had generated a power level that was mathematically impossible for the materials to contain. It had reached an instantaneous speed that surpassed all known limits of aerodynamics, if only for a fraction of a second. The pilot was dead, obliterated by the initial acceleration. The machine, however, was missing. The general's voice, when he finally spoke, was barely a whisper. He ordered the immediate execution of the final protocol, Action Nichts. The official report, written later and smuggled out through neutral Switzerland to maintain the secrecy of the technology, said: Prototype unrecoverable. Total loss due to catastrophic, uncontrolled overthrust. But unrecoverable doesn't mean destroyed. It means missing. The Sturmvogel, the most radical machine of the Third Reich, had been designed to hit the edge of the known envelope. On its final night, fueled by desperation and deadly chemicals, it had not failed. It had punched clean through the envelope entirely, leaving behind a smoking crater and the final, chilling mystery: where had it gone, and what horrifying data had it achieved in the final moment before it vanished from the face of the earth? The evacuation wasn't due to defeat, it was due to the ultimate, terrifying success. The moment the blinding light and the apocalyptic roar subsided, General Kamhuber knew two things with absolute certainty: the pilot was lost, and the data was terrifying. The prototype, the Sturmvogel, had achieved an instantaneous, uncontainable thrust that surpassed every known constraint of German engineering. It had vanished, a silent, high-velocity projectile launched into the stratospheric night, taking its secrets with it. Kammhuber did not wait for daylight. He didn't even wait for the smoke to clear. His fear was not of the Allied armies advancing across the Rhine. His fear was of the knowledge contained in the facility, the equations, the fuel ratios, the stress tolerances. If the Allies recovered those, they wouldn't just replicate the jet, they would bypass years of painful, expensive research, jumping directly to the precipice of the sonic barrier. Within hours, Berlin, acting on Kammhuber's single, panicked, coded communication, a message consisting only of X7, action nichts confirmed, total loss of containment, issued an emergency command. This was the final directive of the Reich's High Technology Division, a chilling, effective exercise in self-erasure. Shutterstock. The three-step eradication. The cover-up was executed with lethal German efficiency, utilizing the very personnel rotation system designed to maintain secrecy. The security unit, compartmentalized and loyal, moved in three deadly, sequential waves. Erase the project. A designated team of engineers, operating under the direct supervision of the SS, descended upon the technical sections. Their sole task was to eliminate the paper trail. Documents were not shredded. They were incinerated in high-temperature, pressurized burners until nothing was left but ash. The magnetic cores of the early computing devices, primitive data logging machines, were subjected to powerful electromagnets, wiping every single recorded spike and variable. The goal was to eliminate all theory and data. Evacuate personnel. The scientists and core engineers, the few who understood the full picture, men like Dr. Volker, who knew the impossible numbers the engine had momentarily achieved, were loaded into heavy transport trucks. They were given new identities, driven west, and dispersed into deep cover civilian roles in areas not yet reached by the Allies. They were not being rescued. They were being sequestered, their knowledge too valuable to fall into enemy hands, and too dangerous to be allowed back into the collapsing regime. The goal was to eliminate all memory and expertise. Seal the facility. The final crew were demolition experts. They didn't blow up the bunkers, which would have signaled the site's importance. Instead, they systematically dismantled the unique machinery. Heavy magnetic cranes were used to pull the massive, non-standard tooling, the complex 5-axis milling machines required for the Sturmvogel's lifting body structure, and either drove them into abandoned mineshafts or deep-sea lakes. Machinery was dismantled, piece by piece. The final touch was the meticulous cleaning of the laboratory floors, scrubbing away the faint, telltale stains of hydrazine and hydrogen peroxide that would betray the volatile nature of the fuel. By dawn, the site looked abandoned for years. Dust was scattered across the floors. Windows were left open to the wind. The only real evidence was the catastrophic scorch mark on the runway, a wound too large to conceal, but one that could be easily misinterpreted as a simple explosion. When Allied forces captured it months later, they found nothing. The T-Force, brilliant as they were forensic and not miracle workers. They could deduce that something big had been here, but they couldn't deduce what. Not a single blueprint or part number survived the Great Erasure. The labyrinth was not a capture, it was an intelligence defeat. The mystery was absolute, as if the project had never existed. But whispers continued. In the post-war chaos, rumors always found a way to travel. Among the demoralized veterans and the engineers absorbed into the Allied and Soviet camps, the story of Flugkörper Null persisted, warped by fear and lack of detail. Some claimed the prototype exploded, disintegrating into a cloud of metal dust the moment the rocket fired, a final, fatal flaw in the engine mounting. Others said it escaped the test stand, launched vertically by the uncontrolled thrust, disappearing beyond the known ceiling of the atmosphere, a silent, nuclear-armed satellite before its time. A few, the true believers and the most fearful, believed it achieved something impossible, a fleeting, momentary glimpse of performance far beyond the technology of the day. A breakthrough so radical, so dangerous, that the Reich didn't want anyone, friend or foe, to know it was even conceivable. The idea that the Nazis destroyed their own ultimate weapon, not out of fear of the enemy, but out of fear of the weapon itself, became the most enduring whisper of all. The aftermath, the Cold War years, the silent influence of a missing machine. The disappearance of the Sturmvogel had a profound, if invisible, effect on the dawning Cold War. Both the American and Soviet camps, having absorbed thousands of captured German scientists and engineers, ran parallel programs to find the missing piece of the puzzle. The Allied scientists, men like Vance, who had seen the scorched concrete and the frantic handwriting, knew that a machine capable of that kind of violent energy release was possible. They just didn't know how. Modern historians, piecing together the fragmented survivor testimony from the 1980s, the forensic analysis of the labyrinth site, and the sudden, panicked orders from Berlin, suspect the truth was simple and terrifying. The prototype may have briefly worked. The goal of Flugkörper Null was not sustained flight, but the momentary capture of data at the extreme boundary of transonic and supersonic speed. The design itself, the lifting body, the hypergolic booster, was a massive risk for a few seconds of information. On that final night, the uncontrolled surge in the rocket motor, triggered perhaps by a flaw in the fuel mixture or a valve malfunction, propelled the machine to an instantaneous thrust-to-weight ratio that was off the charts. The machine was not flying so much as it was being launched. The extreme forces experienced by the airframe, and the pilot, must have been beyond anything known in 1944. It may have reached performance the Nazis were not ready to control. The speed and stresses achieved were far beyond their calculations. Dr. Volker had engineered the airframe to handle a certain, predictable level of supersonic buffeting. The sudden, violent surge exposed the machine to impossibly high Mach numbers, a split second of true, high supersonic flight, generating shockwaves that instantly tore the leading edges of the wings. Aerodynamic heating. At that speed, the air friction would have instantly raised the surface temperature to hundreds of degrees, causing the specialized, thin metal alloys to warp and fail. G-force overload. The vertical and horizontal acceleration would have subjected the pilot to forces that instantly rendered him unconscious, possibly crushing his body against the restraints. The logbook note, total loss of pilot, was the immediate, fatal consequence of the engine's uncontrolled success. The Sturmvogel was a machine too advanced for 1944 hands. It was like giving a Stone Age artisan a nuclear reactor. The potential was staggering, but the ability to contain, understand, and reproduce the success safely was zero. And if a secret project suddenly proves uncontrollable, if its momentary success is instantly lethal and destructive, you don't complete it, you erase it. The engineers, faced with a success that cost a life and a machine, understood the true strategic vulnerability. If they left the blueprints, the Allies would get this lethal technology without having to pay the price in blood and resources. The core secret was not the plane itself, but the potential of the hypergolic jet hybrid power plant and the lifting body design. That knowledge, if captured, could grant the Allies an immediate, unassailable lead in the post-war arms race. What vanished overnight wasn't just a machine. It was a mistake the Nazis refused to admit, a danger they couldn't contain, and a secret they tried to bury forever. They preferred to leave behind a ghost story, the tale of a plane that vanished, rather than a clear, devastating blueprint that could be weaponized by their enemies. The legacy of the Sturmvogel was not its flight, but its terrifying disappearance, a single act of final technological deception that echoed silently through the ensuing decades of the Cold War.